In the 1970s, U.S. spy satellites scanning Soviet military bases picked up unusual activity of a previously unknown combat aircraft on grainy satellite photos. It appeared to be an enormous fighter jet. Unlike anything Western analysts had seen before, its massive wingspan raised alarms in American defense circles. Was this plane capable of speeds beyond anything NATO could match, and more importantly, did any Western Air Force possess the means to intercept it? At the time, very little was known about the capabilities of this mysterious Soviet fighter. Intelligence was limited to low-resolution images taken from orbit, but everything changed when the USSR unexpectedly lost one of its most skilled pilots. On September 6, 1976, Senior Lieutenant Viktor Belenko, a deputy commander of a MiG-25 interceptor unit, kissed his wife Ludmila goodbye, telling her he was heading off for another routine mission. Few could have guessed that just hours later, he would make headlines around the world as a defector. To some, he was a courageous man seeking freedom. To others, a traitor who betrayed his country's secrets. That day, regular flight exercises were underway. Marshal of Aviation Yevgeny Savitsky had arrived in the Far East to conduct surprise readiness checks. During training flights, planes were typically fueled to only 80% capacity. However, Belenko reported mechanical issues with his aircraft. Since command was distracted, the problem was ignored, and he was assigned a different MiG-25 fully fueled and ready for emergency takeoff. Around 2 p.m. Radar contact was suddenly lost with one of the jets. Emergency units were scrambled to search for the missing aircraft. Meanwhile, a new target was detected heading toward Hokkaido, Japan. Flying at extremely low altitude to avoid detection, Belenko made his way toward his destination, a civilian airport. With fuel nearly exhausted, he initiated his descent. However, the runway was occupied by a commercial Boeing 727. A mid-air collision was avoided by seconds. The runway proved too short for the high-speed MiG-25, which overshot by over 250 meters, knocking down several antennas before coming to a stop with the help of its emergency parachute. Belenko exited the cockpit, climbed onto the wing, and fired 2 warning shots into the air. Within minutes, local police and airport security arrived on the scene. He surrendered immediately. Civilian flights were suspended for 5 hours while the aircraft was covered and removed under tight security. Viktor Belenko was born on February 15, 1947, in Nalchik, into a modest working-class family. After his parents separated, he lived with his mother until she abandoned him at age 2. He was then raised by relatives, followed by his father and stepmother. In 1965, he graduated from school with honors. Before joining the military, he worked in factories in Omsk, attended night classes, and earned a recommendation to attend flight school. He also briefly studied medicine and participated in aviation clubs through DASAF. He graduated from the Higher Military Aviation School for Pilots in 1971 and served as an instructor at the Stavropol Aviation School. Throughout his service, he was considered a model officer, a member of the Communist Party CPSU, active in Komsomol youth organizations, and respected among peers. In 1975, he requested a transfer to the Far East and was assigned to the 530th Fighter Aviation Regiment of the 11th Air Army under the Soviet Air Defense Forces PVO. His primary aircraft was the MiG-25, a plane he knew better than almost anyone else in the Soviet Union. 22 days after the dramatic incident, on September 28, 1976, the Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued an official statement via TASS. It claimed that Belenko had been forced to land due to technical difficulties and urged immediate action to repatriate both the pilot and the aircraft. Soviet media suggested that the pilot may have been acting under coercion or external influence. On the same day, Belenko's wife and mother arrived in Moscow for a press conference, where they publicly pleaded for his return. The Soviet government warned that Japan's refusal to hand over the aircraft could lead to serious international consequences. Diplomatic talks began between Soviet Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko and his Japanese counterpart. Japan responded that a criminal investigation was already underway. Citing border violations committed by the pilot, the MiG-25 was treated as key evidence in the case, making its return impossible at that time. Throughout the month, Soviet state media continued to push their narrative. Belenko had landed out of necessity, not choice, and was being held against his will by Western intelligence agencies. Meanwhile, on September 19, CIA Director George H.W. Bush described the event as a major intelligence breakthrough. He confirmed that cooperation with the defector was progressing rapidly. Belenko formally applied for political asylum in the United States. During a meeting with Soviet Representative Vasily Sadovnikov, a KGB officer operating under diplomatic cover, he was offered assistance in returning home. Sadovnikov attempted to persuade him, claiming, "You were misled. You were forced to land, perhaps even under the influence of drugs. We can help you reunite with your family." The pilot responded firmly, "Don't bother. I came here by my own choice." As he was about to leave the room, Sadovnikov, the Soviet representative, muttered under his breath, "We never forget traitors. One day, we'll find you." However, it wasn't until the collapse of the USSR that Belenko's story resurfaced in public memory. Japanese journalists produced a documentary detailing his new life abroad, while U.S. officials confirmed that his asylum had been personally approved by the president. Eventually, he became an American citizen, recognized for the valuable intelligence he provided. A full psychological and personal background check was conducted on Belenko. Investigators interviewed 116 individuals, including family members and former colleagues. They gathered information on his physical and mental health, personal relationships, professional conduct, and ideological views. There was no prior indication of any strong desire to leave for the West. Still, investigators found evidence that Belenko had grown increasingly frustrated with military life, particularly with the chaotic work schedule and lack of proper rest days. The idea of escape reportedly took root a year earlier, when he overheard someone joking that the Americans would pay handsomely just to examine the MiG-25 up close. Though the remark seemed trivial at first, it stayed with him and eventually played a role in shaping his decision months later. In preparation for the defection, Belenko logged about 30 hours of solo flight time on the MiG-25. Seizing a moment of oversight by ground crew, he ensured the plane was fully fueled before takeoff. The aircraft vanished from radar just 15 seconds after lifting off. According to his wife, all of his official documents remained at home, yet foreign media reported that some papers, including his birth certificate, were taken during his detention. It's possible he carried them intentionally. His psychological profile revealed a pattern of frequent disagreements with superiors. While stationed at the Stavropol Flight School, he repeatedly asked to be transferred to a combat unit. But experienced pilots like him were rarely reassigned, a policy that only added to his growing frustration. In 1975, he even submitted a formal request to leave the military, citing his refusal to serve under officers who consumed alcohol regularly. Once transferred to the Far East, Belenko initially performed well, successfully completing training on the MiG-25R, earning the position of acting squadron staff officer, and fulfilling his duties without complaints from command. But by mid-1976, his behavior began to change. He appeared more anxious, often pale, with visible red marks appearing on his face and neck. On September 6, fellow pilots noticed that his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't even connect his radio headset, forcing a technician to step in. Although he had completed the required service time by January 1976, the rank of captain was never officially conferred. That promotion would have allowed him to apply to a military academy. One of his long-held ambitions, Belenko later admitted that the spark for his decision came from a book he read as a child, Spartacus by Howard Fast. In a later interview, he elaborated further on what led him to defect. Interview excerpt: Belenko reflects on his decision. Question: as a fighter pilot in the Soviet Air Force, your living conditions were better than those of many ordinary citizens. What ultimately made you decide to abandon everything and flee? And what did you truly believe about life in America, a country you knew very little about? Belenko, at the time, Soviet propaganda portrayed Americans as people living in a collapsing society, barely holding on. But I had already realized that it was our system, not theirs, that was failing. It operated without basic human rights or freedoms. I've always questioned things, being an engineer by nature. My doubts about the Soviet system started forming back in my student years. For example, if the US is really so terrible, how did they manage to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely? How could they build the best aircraft in the world? Why do so many Nobel Prize winners come from their universities? If I had voiced these thoughts out loud in the late 1960s, I might have ended up in a psychiatric hospital. So I made up my own mind. America wasn't nearly as bad as we were told. Question: how long did it take to plan your escape? What kind of preparation was involved? Bulenko: it's difficult to pinpoint an exact timeline. My decision didn't come suddenly. It developed gradually as my views changed over time. I always considered myself one of the top pilots in my unit. In my younger years, I truly believed in socialist and communist ideals. They sounded fair, offering full employment, free education, healthcare, pensions, and support for families. But with time, I realized that these benefits were mostly reserved for those connected to the party elite. I saw that I couldn't change the system from within, nor could I live a normal life under it. The only way out was what I called a break, a complete separation from that reality. My profession as a pilot didn't determine my choice. Even if I had been a simple mechanic, I would have still looked for a way to escape. In 1996, when I reflected on everything, I realized that although new freedoms existed in Russia, society was still far from open. It took me time to make that final step. My decision solidified about a month before the escape. Inside, I felt a sense of calm, like I was walking above the clouds. For the first time in my life, I felt true freedom. For the plan to work, the key conditions were necessary: favorable weather over Japan and a fully fueled aircraft. Took nearly a month for everything to align perfectly. During this time, I continued performing my duties diligently so as not to raise suspicion. Command even considered promoting me. And finally, on September 6, 1976, all the pieces came together. By the way, I didn't technically steal the plane. I had clearance from air traffic control for that day's flight. I simply changed course once I was already airborne. Question: why did you specifically choose the United States instead of another country like Canada? Bulenko: we studied American history in school. I saw the US as a land of immigrants, a place where people from around the world could find a new home. I analyzed its achievements and concluded that the US was still the global leader in technology and innovation. To be honest, I didn't have a clear picture of daily life there. I knew it was different from what we had back home. Question: what was the biggest cultural shock for you after arriving in the US? Bulenko: the hardest adjustment was understanding the concept of real personal choice. In the Soviet Union, almost every aspect of life was controlled by the state: where to work, where to live, even how to die. Learning that I now had to make my own decisions and bear responsibility for them was challenging. At first, once I started living in a free environment, however, that independence became the most valuable part of my new life. At first, I felt like an outsider. One of my strongest memories is visiting a large American supermarket for the first time. I couldn't believe my eyes. There were so many products, no queues, everything just available. I thought it might be staged, maybe CIA's staff had cleared the shelves especially for me. But later I realized this was real. It was a shock, yes, but a pleasant one. Every day, I tried something new. Once I bought a can-labeled lunch. I cooked it with potatoes and onions. Tasted great. The next morning, my friends asked, "Did you get a cat?" Turns out, it was pet food. Still, it wasn't bad. Question: did you try to contact your family in the Soviet Union? Bulenko: no. I avoided any communication. I ignored attempts organized by intelligence services through relatives. I told American investigators that I wanted nothing to do with my wife or past life. My relationship with my stepmother was distant. And the last time I saw my son Mitri was when he was just 3 years old. His grandmother took him away shortly after. Meanwhile, my ex-wife Ludmila rarely gives interviews, but when she does, she says, even today, I don't know whether to light a candle for his soul or for his health. According to her, we live peacefully. She never complained about our marriage. Though some reports claimed I requested a transfer near the border for access to modern aircraft. We were together for 5 years and had a son, she recalls. He had a future ahead of him. Why would he leave? What would he even do abroad? Fly sports planes at best, she said. She never hid the truth from their son. I told him his father is the best man in the world, she adds. Even after everything, people treated her with respect. Question: what happened to you after the defection? Belenko, on October 14, 1980, the U.S. Congress passed a special law granting me American citizenship. After that, I worked as an aerospace engineer and also served as a consultant for military agencies. Question: what role did the MiG-25 play in your escape? Belenko, the MiG-25 was one of the most advanced fighters of its time. And that's exactly why Western intelligence had been trying to get their hands on it for years. Thanks to my defection, this aircraft finally became accessible to experts in both the US and Japan. After I landed at Hokkaido Airport, the Japanese authorities immediately built a hangar on the plane to prevent any unwanted observation. It was later dismantled and transported to the United States for detailed technical analysis. Eventually, parts of the aircraft were also studied at a military facility in Japan. Experts classified it as a high-altitude interceptor, simple to maintain and easy to operate. One notable finding was how effectively it could avoid detection by Japanese air defense radars. As a result, Japan decided to upgrade its radar systems and purchased modern American surveillance equipment, capable of tracking multiple airborne targets simultaneously. Question: how did the Soviet Union react to the loss of the aircraft? Belenko, the USSR took the incident very seriously, almost as a national humiliation. They closely monitored every move the plane made while in Japan and increased diplomatic pressure continuously. On September 27th, Japan's Prime Minister announced that the aircraft would be returned, but only after all research was completed, which meant not before October 5th. Meanwhile, the Soviet government demanded compensation for damages and insisted on an investigation into the incident. Japan agreed to pay part of the requested amount but refused to allow Soviet specialists direct access to the base where the plane was being examined. Instead, inspections were allowed only aboard a ship during daylight hours. And under strict supervision, the aircraft was carefully disassembled, packed into 13 crates, and loaded onto a Soviet cargo ship at Hitachi port. The packaging was so elaborate that much of the inspection time was spent simply unpacking the components. Soviet engineers, including Lev Shinji, noted that the Americans seemed deliberately slow in returning the parts, likely to conceal how much they had actually learned. In the end, Japan billed the Soviets $40,000 for damage caused during landing, specifically to two antennas. The US covered the cost, and on November 15, 1976, the MiG-25 officially left Japanese territory. Interestingly, I personally believe the return happened too quickly. I suggested keeping the plane longer for further study. Question: what happened to the aircraft after it was returned to the USSR? Belenko, upon its return, the MiG-25 underwent modifications and upgrades. Soviet engineers, including those like Shengalea, worked extensively on it. However, American media reports were quick to criticize the plane's design, highlighting the use of outdated vacuum tubes instead of transistors, making it seem like the Soviet aviation industry was stuck in the Stone Age. In reality, the aircraft was never flown operationally again after its return. It was reassembled and repurposed as a training aid at one of the Soviet Air Defense Forces flight schools. Despite its reputation, the MiG-25 incorporated some highly advanced technologies for its time. Its fuselage was entirely constructed from high-strength steel using welding techniques, a major departure from the aluminum alloys typically used in aviation. This was necessary because the aircraft could reach speeds over Mach 3. causing surface temperatures up to 300 degrees Celsius. American analyst Stephen Trimble later pointed out that the plane's combat capabilities were largely overestimated, once thoroughly examined by U.S. specialists. It became clear that the MiG-25 wasn't the unstoppable threat many in the Pentagon had feared. Was designed for specific missions, not as a general-purpose fighter. Its radar system lagged behind U.S. technology by several years. But there was an upside. The use of vacuum tubes made the aircraft resistant to electromagnetic pulses from nuclear detonations, a unique advantage in certain scenarios. The powerful engines consumed enormous amounts of fuel, limiting range. The MiG could climb fast, cross airspace quickly, deliver a strike or conduct reconnaissance, and then needed to refuel. Despite these limitations, the USSR produced more than 1,200 units of the MiG-25. For the Soviet military, it became a symbol of strength and technological prowess. At the time, it was considered the second fastest operational aircraft in the world, just behind the SR-71 Blackbird. India, for example, operated the reconnaissance variant for nearly 25 years. Only in 2006 were these planes retired due to lack of spare parts. Trimble noted that the biggest impact of the MiG-25 wasn't technological, it was psychological. Before 1976, NATO didn't know that the MiG-25 couldn't intercept the SR-71 Blackbird. That uncertainty gave the Soviet Union a strategic edge in defending its airspace against American spy flights. Following his defection, Belenko expressed willingness to cooperate with U.S. intelligence, but only under one condition: he wanted unrestricted access to real U.S. military operations. He asked to visit an active airbase and an aircraft carrier, emphasizing that he wanted to see everyday life in the Air Force and Navy, not polished demonstrations or staged events. His goal was to understand the true state of American military readiness, beyond what propaganda claimed. At the end of 1976, Viktor Belenko was taken to Langley Air Force Base, where he was allowed to use an aviation flight simulator typically used for training American pilots. At that time, 2 technicians were completing their own training session. What Belenko witnessed left a deep impression on him. He later remarked that in the Soviet Union, such simulators were rarely used in practice, and access to them was tightly restricted even for experienced pilots. Another striking difference for him was the way officers interacted with enlisted personnel. The informal and open communication between ranks would have been unthinkable within the rigid structure of the Soviet military. In January 1977, Belenko toured the aircraft carrier John F. Kennedy, which was docked at a U.S. naval facility. During his visit, he met members of the crew, spoke with pilots and sailors, and was given regular Navy meals. He was also questioned about how Soviet pilots carried out interception missions. His knowledge and flying skills were highly regarded by American pilots. Rear Admiral Roger Box, who oversaw the Navy's instructor training program, noted that Belenko was deeply impressed by the efficiency and coordination of flight deck operations. He chose not to go below deck but instead spent the night outside, observing aircraft takeoffs and landings. As he departed the ship, Belenko admitted that he had initially suspected everything had been arranged especially for him. However, when he saw how operations continued non-stop around the clock, he realized that such high-level coordination could not possibly have been staged solely for his benefit. During his early months in the United States, Belenko remained under constant scrutiny from the CIA, military analysts, doctors, and psychologists. At the same time, he began studying English through a college-level course, which enabled him to speak directly with specialists without needing translators. One intelligence official observed that beyond bringing the MiG-25 into Western hands, Belenko himself was an invaluable source of information, offering insights ranging from tactical procedures to internal workings of the Soviet Air Forces. 3 months after arriving, officials estimated it might take up to another year to fully process all the intelligence he provided. His value as a defector turned out to be far greater than initially anticipated. Eventually, Belenko settled in Washington, where he worked as a consultant for government agencies and private defense companies involved in Aviation. He also took part in various commercial projects. After relocating to the U.S., he became a familiar figure at public and professional events. He gave lectures at military institutions, collaborated with American firms, and appeared in media as an expert commentator. Over the years, he built strong relationships with instructors, academics, and graduates from prominent aviation schools. The book MiG Pilot was later published, based on a personal manuscript he wrote shortly after obtaining U.S. citizenship. Edited by American writer John Byron, it detailed his reasons for defecting and recounted key events from his life, all told from his perspective. While editing the book, Byron adapted some parts to make them more relatable to Western readers, adjusting emotional passages to better fit the narrative style common in the U.S. In 2000, during an interview at an air show, Belenko shared an anecdote about meeting Soviet cosmonaut Igor Volk, who claimed he had heard that Belenko was dead. "I told him not quite," Belenko said. "The KGB spread rumors about my death to discourage others from following my path." A Soviet investigation later exposed widespread misconduct among party officials, including neglect toward loyal officers while others advanced through political connections rather than merit. Several senior officers from the Soviet Air Defense Forces were found responsible for lapses in flight safety and pilot oversight, and were punished accordingly. Viktor Ivanovich Belenko, born in 1947, was condemned in absentia by the Supreme Court of the Russian SFSR under Article 64 of the Soviet Criminal Code, defined as treason against the motherland. The court ordered the severest penalty of execution by firing squad. In the wake of the incident, the Soviet Union implemented stricter oversight of its aviation personnel. Officers who were single, divorced, or considered to have unstable personal lives were removed from flight duties and reassigned to non-operational roles. Top officials launched a sweeping internal review aimed at identifying individuals deemed potentially disloyal. Names of such personnel were compiled and passed up through the chain of command. Many were quickly transferred away from border units to domestic positions in technical or support functions, while others were reassigned to different branches of the military altogether. These control measures began almost immediately after Belenko's defection and continued for an extended period. Flight training requirements were dramatically increased, raising the bar for pilot qualification. The KGB was especially active in its investigation, searching for evidence that Belenko had been contacted or recruited by foreign intelligence before his escape. However, no such proof was ever found. Meanwhile, far from the reach of Soviet authorities, the former pilot started a new life abroad, eventually building a family and having 3 children with another woman. The fallout also affected cultural figures. Artists and performers faced travel restrictions, particularly to Japan, which lasted for many years. The summer and autumn of 1976 turned into a troubling period for Soviet aviation. It saw a series of border violations and defections. For example, on July 14th, Syrian pilot Mahmoud Musli Yassin defected to Iraq in a MiG-25, just 50 days before Belenko's escape. On July 17th, another Syrian pilot flew a MiG-21 to the same country, 17 days after Belenko's flight. On September 23, 1976, Soviet Reserve officer Valentin Zosimov followed suit, flying an Antu aircraft to Iran, where he already had ties in civil aviation. September 1976 was later described by the New York Times as the month of escapes from the Soviet bloc. To prevent further defections, the Soviet leadership applied intense pressure on Iran's government. The level of diplomatic threats used was unprecedented in Soviet-Iranian relations. Eventually, under this pressure, the Shah agreed to extradite Zosimov back to the USSR, despite protests from international human rights organizations. In one of his interviews with Voice of America, Belenko stated that he would be willing to provide information to young Soviet pilots, including coordinates of Japanese airfields and ways to avoid radar detection. A journalist added, "Give me 10 minutes on the radio and within a week, 6 more planes will land here." However, the US government rejected the idea, believing that mass defections would interfere with ongoing intelligence priorities. Soviet leaders viewed the damage caused by Belenko's actions as severe. They were forced to overhauled the identification system used to distinguish friendly from hostile aircraft, modernized the MiG-25 itself, and introduced design modifications. According to estimates, these changes cost the Soviet Union around 2 billion rubles. This case exposed serious flaws in how military personnel were managed and selected, especially those stationed in air borders. As a result, it led to major reforms in how the Soviet military handled pilot assignments and security clearances, marking one of the most significant lessons learned from the incident.